Okay, I think we're ready to go. Thank you all for joining us for today's webinar, Celebrating Migration, the Return of Birds Through Canada's Flyway. My name is Catherine Focal, and I'm the Director of North American Partnerships at the Nature Conservancy of Canada, and I'll be your moderator today. I'd like to start by stating that we at the Nature Conservancy of Canada respectfully acknowledge that the work we do across the country is on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. For a millennia, they have worked to protect these landscapes and the life these areas sustain. I would like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. The Nature Conservancy of Canada is a national charity and Canada's leading not-for-profit private land conservation organization, working to protect our most important natural areas and the species they sustain. Since 1962, NCC and its partners have helped to protect 14 million hectares, that's 35 million acres, coast to coast to coast. To learn more, visit our website, www.natureconservancy.ca. Migratory birds need healthy and diverse habitats along their flight routes, or flyways, so they can breed and raise their young every spring and leave for better food sources and optimal climates every fall. The habitat conserved along these routes provide that necessary resting, feeding, and breeding habitat, and international governments, NGOs, and individuals collaborate on a continental, national, and local scale to identify and conserve these places. Many of you joining our call today will likely have heard that North America has lost nearly 3 billion birds since 1970. This staggering loss suggests the very fabric of North America's ecosystem is unraveling. Now, 3 billion is a big number to comprehend. To put it in context, it means a loss of 1 in 4 birds vanished in our lifetime, and the vast majority of these are migratory birds. Today, we'd like to discuss what we can do to bring back these birds, and we'll be joined by 3 of our NCC speakers. Vari McFarlane, Director of Science and Stewardship for the Ontario region, Michael Burek, Program Director for Southwest Saskatchewan, and Alison Patrick, Conservation Biologist for the Atlantic region. Before we begin the webinar, I'd like to quickly cover a few housekeeping topics. As we're being joined by people from across the country, you may experience a temporary glitch during the live stream. We thank you in advance for your patience. Today's webinar is being recorded. We will be sharing a link to the recording after the event, so keep an eye on your inboxes. We welcome you to revisit the content yourself and share it with colleagues, friends, and family. We want you to join in on the conversation and share your thoughts with the online community. Feel free to connect with us through Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram using the hashtag #NCCNatureTalks during and after the webinar. We also invite your comments and questions. You'll notice a Q&A chat box on your screen. If you think of a question for the speakers at any time, just type it in there. Include who the question's intended for, and we'll answer them at the end of the webinar. At this time, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Vari McFarlane, Director of Science and Stewardship for the Ontario region. Vari received her undergraduate degree in ecology from the University of Stirling, Scotland, and her PhD in behavioral ecology from the University of Exeter in Cornwall, England. She's worked as a conservation biologist for the Nature Conservancy of Canada since March of 2008 and has coordinated field-scale restorations of various habitats throughout southwestern Ontario from Niagara to Pelee Island. The floor is all yours, Vari.
Hi, thanks so much, Catherine. Thanks for being here today. So why do these birds migrate anyway? As you've heard a little bit already, it really is as simple as finding food. As many of you are aware, Canada can get pretty tough in the winter. It's also really tough on birds. Several species, of course, do stay, keeping us company throughout the winter, and a few, like these red crossbills, even breed in the depths of winter here in Canada, but many others move off in search of food. There are several broad flyways or routes which migratory birds take each year. These are the approximate routes that the largest numbers of birds will follow. Of course, there's plenty of movement in between these as well, so if you don't see yourself on this map, don't worry, you can still see migratory birds without traveling too far. It's all the more extraordinary to think that many of these birds only weigh a few grams and manage to use a variety of cues, including day length, weather patterns, and the Earth's electromagnetic fields, to navigate thousands of kilometers twice every year. These incredible feats of endurance take place right under our noses, or rather, in fact, above our heads every single spring and fall, and are underway right now. In fact, about 288 million birds were forecast to have been on the move just last night in the US, and many of these birds are heading to Canada right now. So if you're in southern Ontario, like I am, look up in the early morning and you might see flocks of loons migrating right over your house, even if you're right in the city. This movement of birds spans countries, linking continents, and in fact, you could say that we're all linked by birds. This slide shows an incredible animation of a mixture of amateur observational data and radar information, and it shows the movement of magnolia warblers between their wintering areas in Central America and their breeding habitat in Canada's boreal zone. You can check out the dates and time your birding excursions accordingly. I'll be looking out for these in my neighbourhood over the next week or so as they come back north. Although I really like birds, I know not everyone does. However, there's lots of reasons why we all need to care about them. They actually do an awful lot for us without us even asking. One simple example is that the birdwatching industry is significant and growing every day. Birds help spread seeds, including the seeds of some important tree species. They clean up our waste in some cases, and I know many of us are finding in these tough times they help our mental health and well-being. You may have seen the news articles surrounding a recent publication in the Journal of Ecological Economics, which showed this scientifically that birds make us happy. Not only are birds important, they're pretty much everywhere. They're found on every continent. Many will occupy urban areas like this American robin I found nesting in a traffic light last year in London, Ontario. Other species are much more fussy though, with really specific habitat needs, and these are often the ones which need our help the most urgently. In particular, shorebirds, which we'll learn about shortly, need very specific habitat in exactly the right place so they can refuel on their long journeys north in spring and south again in the fall. And with that, I'll pass it back to Catherine to introduce our next speaker.
Thanks so much, Vari, for giving us a brief introduction into bird migration and why we should care about bird populations. Our next speaker today is Mike Burek, the Program Director for Southwest Saskatchewan. Mike's current position corresponds with the mixed grassland and cypress upland ecoregions of the province. He joined NCC in 2015 after spending a number of years working throughout the prairie provinces as a wildlife biologist in the environmental consulting industry. During his time with NCC, Mike has worked on a wide variety of projects, including land acquisitions, conservation easements, land management, restoration, and engagement with Indigenous nations. Whenever you're ready, Mike.
Sorry about that. Okay. All right. Sorry about that. There, got away from me a little bit. Thanks, Catherine. Given that there are so many different groups of birds that migrate, I thought I would choose one specifically to highlight. One of the groups of birds that undertake some of the longest migrations are shorebirds, with species like the red knot wintering at the southern tip of South America and then migrating all the way up to the Arctic to nest. Don't worry if you're unfamiliar with shorebirds, as I will explain a bit more about them in the next slide. Unlike most other groups of birds, shorebird migration occurs along 3 flyways instead of 4, the Pacific, the Mid-Continental, and the Atlantic flyways. The Mid-Continental flyway for shorebirds is a combination of the Central and Mississippi flyways that cover most of the inland or interior areas of Canada and the US. As Vari just mentioned, shorebirds are one of the groups that can be pretty fussy or particular about where exactly they stop to refuel and rest during their very long flight from South America to the Arctic. Shorebirds that migrate along the Mid-Continental flyway often have a preference for grasslands, wetlands, and even non-natural habitats. In contrast, birds that migrate along the Pacific or Atlantic flyways tend to prefer coastal habitats. As you can see in the photo here in the slide, shorebirds are notorious for migrating in large flocks like this group of sanderlings. As promised, here's a quick overview of what exactly is a shorebird. Shorebirds are typically small birds with an upright stance or tall posture. They have long legs, which help them to navigate sand, mud, and shallow water, and long toes to help give them stability when walking on those types of substrates. Most shorebird species have mottled plumage to help them camouflage, but there is a surprising amount of variation in both colors and in size between the different species. They also have long, thin bills to help them grab small aquatic insects and other invertebrates while feeding. All of these characteristics make them very well adapted to a variety of shallow aquatic habitats. Shorebirds are often difficult to ID because of their small size and are typically very busy feeding in larger groups, making it hard to pick out different individuals. Semi-palmated sandpipers, like the one pictured in this image here, are actually one of the trickier groups in particular to ID. These are a few photos of a few examples of both Arctic and prairie nesting shorebirds. For the Arctic nesters, we have a mixed group of black-bellied plovers and red knots in the background of the slide photo here. And then you can see in the bottom left corner, we have a sanderling. For our prairie nesting birds, our top right, we have a piping plover, and then in the kind of that middle bubble in the middle of the slide there, we have an upland sandpiper. Both of these species, the piping plover and the upland sandpiper, are not just prairie province specifically, but they still prefer open habitats throughout other areas where they do occur, like in Ontario. Piping plovers are also found on the Atlantic coast as well, but that's actually a different subspecies than the one we have here in the prairie provinces and in Ontario. Earlier in the presentation today, we heard that over 3 billion birds have been lost. Shorebirds numbers have declined by as much as 70% since the 1970s. Species like the piping plover and red knot are both listed federally as an endangered species due to habitat loss, unsustainable harvest of their primary food sources, and even overhunting. It'll probably surprise a lot of people to learn that southern Saskatchewan is just as important for shorebird migration and shorebird conservation as the east and west coasts are. That's because the only inland site in Canada to be designated by the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network to be of hemispheric importance to shorebirds is located here in southern Saskatchewan. The area that I'm referring to is right along the Trans-Canada Highway, midway between the cities of Swift Current and Moose Jaw, and about 150 kilometers or an hour and a half's drive west of Regina. While considered to be a single site or a complex, Chaplin, Old Wives, and Reed Lakes host over 100,000 individuals of more than 30 species of shorebirds every summer. Some species spend a few days at the site to rest and refuel before completing their journey to nest in the Arctic, and others nest along the lakes or in the areas immediately adjacent. The site received its designation of hemispheric importance in 1997 in recognition of the substantial number of several different species that rely on these lakes as a stopover site. As much as 25% of the North American population and 50% of the mid-continental flyway population of sanderling, pictured in the photo there, use the site as a critical refueling stop, along with over 20% of the stilt sandpiper population. Reed and Chaplin Lakes have also been designated as critical habitat under the Federal Species at Risk Act for both the red knot and piping plover. Chaplin Lake in particular is home to the second highest breeding population of piping plovers in the province. While the site is very busy during the spring migration, numbers are much lower in the fall. The reason for that is because most shorebird migrations are elliptical in shape, with birds following the mid-continental flyway north in the spring and then following the Atlantic flyway back south in the fall. And we're going to learn more about the Atlantic flyway right away here. That being said, some of the species who nest locally, such as Wilson's phalaropes, are known to stage in large numbers on Chaplin Lake prior to their fall migration. At Old Wives and Reed Lakes, the relatively large size of the lakes, the shallow water levels, and the seasonal water fluctuations create large expanses of mudflats, which are ideal foraging habitat for shorebirds. Chaplin Lake, on the other hand, is broken into a number of cells by a series of roads and dikes as part of a sodium sulfate mining operation. Water depth within the various cells is regulated by the mining operation, as well as by natural precipitation and evaporation. Throughout the spring and summer months, the lake has varying water depth and salinity levels, resulting in both foraging habitat and roosting habitat along the dikes. Because shorebirds prefer to travel in such large groups, they need a lot of space and a lot of food resources to accommodate them. There are actually very few sites that are used by such high numbers of individuals. This is because instead of flying short distances, they tend to spend over a week at a given site resting and refueling before taking off again, allowing them to fly much farther distances. For some species, they'll only stop 3 times between leaving South America or the Gulf of Mexico and arriving all the way up to the Arctic. For sanderlings in particular, Chaplin, Old Wives, and Reed Lakes is one of those spots. In addition to shorebirds, the lakes also host large numbers of migrating waterfowl, as well as a wide variety of other water birds, including gulls, terns, grebes, pelicans, and cormorants. While you might think of more tropical locations when you think of cormorants and pelicans, both of these species regularly nest here in Canada. Reed Lake actually has a nesting colony of American white pelicans and cormorants on a small island in the middle of the lake, which has been active for many years. Beyond the lakes and shorelines of Chaplin, Old Wives, and Reed Lakes, the uplands that surround these lakes provide high-quality habitat that is very valuable to many grassland birds, in particular ground nesting songbirds, sharp-tailed grouse, and raptors. There's also an abundance of big game species, including mule deer, white-tailed deer, and moose. The soil conditions around Chaplin and Old Wives Lake are most conducive to cattle grazing, resulting in grazing and pasture land as the predominant land use in those areas. Reed Lake, on the other hand, is largely surrounded by cultivated land, which is used to grow annual crops, with small amounts of remnant pasture land, some of which is owned but managed by NCC. When managed appropriately, both hayland and grazing can be beneficial uses of the land, both for birds and for grassland ecosystems. So now that I've gone into some detail about the importance of the Chaplin Old Wives Reed Lake site, I also want to highlight the work that NCC has done and is currently doing within the area. The Chaplin Old Wives Reed Lakes area falls within NCC's Missouri-Coteau Natural Area. NCC has been actively working in the area since 2002, so almost 20 years now, and currently owns and manages over 1,400 hectares, or 3,500 acres of grassland habitat. Between six separate properties, these properties consist of native grassland, tame or seeded grassland, hayland, shoreline, and open water. Over the past few years, NCC has been working in a collaborative partnership with the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network, Environment and Climate Change Canada, Ducks Unlimited Canada, Chaplin Tourism, and other interested stakeholders to try and revitalize public education of the importance of the area for shorebirds and conservation in general. Hopefully this helps provide some insight into migration and the importance of the Canadian prairies to shorebird conservation. Thanks very much, everybody. If you have any questions for me, please hang on to them until the live Q&A. And with that, I will hand it back to Catherine.
Thanks, Mike. We're grateful for your time today and for sharing why the prairies are important to shorebirds along the mid-continental flyways. Our final speaker today is Alison Patrick, conservation biologist for the Atlantic region. Alison joined NCC in 2016 after completing a Bachelor of Science with honors at Queen's University in Kingston and a Master of Science in Wildlife from Humboldt State University in Northern California. She traveled around Canada and the US for several years, working as a field technician on bird conservation projects and honing her plant ID skills. She's currently co-leading the Port of St. John Wetlands Project, which is collecting important data on tidal and coastal wetlands through the Port of St. John. Take it away, Alison.
Thank you, Catherine. So, traveling now to the Atlantic Flyway along the east coast of the Americas, I would like to highlight two important of NCC sites for birds in New Brunswick. So the first is Johnson's Mills. It is also a wizard landscape of hemispheric importance to shorebirds, similar to the one that Mike just described. The difference being that the Bay of Fundy and Johnson's Mills is very important for fall migration of shorebirds. The second is the Musquash Estuary. This is the only marine protected area in New Brunswick, and it's very important because of its large salt marshes and its estuary in a natural condition. And as a result, is home to many species of birds, mammals, fish, invertebrates, and plants. And it's just located here. At Johnson's Mills, semi-palmated sandpipers, which are a type of shorebird, rest and refuel during their fall migration. These incredible birds arrive at Johnson's Mills in mid to late July, and numbers peak in mid-August. They have just been in the Arctic for their breeding season, and they feed on the invertebrates in the mudflats of the Bay of Fundy when the tide is out, and rest on the shore when the tide is in. They rely on the Bay of Fundy to fuel up for a few weeks before they fly non-stop to South America, where they'll spend the winter. On the Bay of Fundy, they actually double their weight, going from the weight of 1 strawberry to the weight of 2 strawberries. In spring, they begin the cycle again and travel up to the Arctic along a different path and not passing through Johnson's Mills. NCC's nature reserve at Johnson's Mills is 228 hectares, which is just over 500 acres. And part of the goal of the nature reserve is education to the public about these amazing birds. People are asked to stay off the beach at high tide because the birds need to rest there. And Johnson's Mills is part of, oh yes, there's a photo of the birds resting at high tide when the water's in, and all of these light gray blobs are actually huge groups of birds. Sorry, there we go. And this is actually where the Bay of Fundy Wizard site is located, and it's composed of 4 bays in the Bay of Fundy in the upper end, so surrounded by this black box, and they're located between New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. And Johnson's Mills is part of the upper leftmost bay. And at one time, it was estimated that more than 1 million semi-palmated sandpipers relied on this wizard site in the Bay of Fundy each year. Current estimates suggest populations have declined by more than half to around 400,000. So because the Bay of Fundy and Johnson's Mills is such an important site for these birds, NCC has encouraged and supported a lot of research going on at Johnson's Mills by university researchers, the Canadian Wildlife Service, and other partners. As you can see from the graphs on the left, researchers were able to track the birds along their migration, and they discovered that birds traveling up north in the spring didn't follow the same route as the one they followed in the fall. The red dots show locations where birds were recorded, and you may be able to see in the diagram in the fall that they do visit Atlantic Canada. The annual migratory route of these birds is quite repeatable from year to year, so knowing where they travel is very important for conservation efforts, as we can try to protect these key stopover sites along their long journey. And you may be wondering how researchers were able to collect this type of detailed data. There's a lot of really cool technology that they're using, and it's revolutionized our understanding of all of this. Researchers at Johnson's Mills have installed radio transmitters and field-readable tags onto the some of the semi-palmated sandpipers. I was actually able to help with some of this research a few summers ago, and it was amazing to hold one of these birds in my hand. Another really neat piece of technology that I wanted to tell you about is the MODIS Wildlife Tracking System. MODIS is a program of Birds Canada in partnership with collaborating researchers and organizations from around the world, and was actually developed at Acadia University in Nova Scotia, Canada. And how it works is that birds, and also sometimes butterflies and dragonflies, get outfitted with a tiny, very light tracking device called a nano tag, and it's about the size of your thumbnail. And as you can see in this diagram, it's like glued as a little backpack onto the back of the bird. And basically then, as the bird completes its migration and goes about its regular business, and travels, there's a vast network of tracking stations set up along the coasts and inland. And in this diagram is shown by all these light blue dots. And when the bird is in range within a certain distance of a tower, the tag registers in the tower, and researchers can track the bird's movement at quite fine scales over time to see where they go. And in order to protect animals such as these, you really need to know a lot about them and their year-round cycle. So conservation must operate at a truly international scale. And this also will help us prioritize the most important sites for conservation and encourages working with partners. So speaking of prioritizing conservation dollars, let us now travel to the Musquash Estuary. This is an incredibly important site, also along the Bay of Fundy, but closer to the city of St. John. And it was designated as a marine protected area by Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada in 2006 because of its large salt marshes and its intact estuary. In the Bay of Fundy, more than 85% of the original salt marshes have been altered by humans over the past 300 years, so this estuary is very special. And thanks to our donors and partners, NCC has built a large conservation area around the Musquash Estuary that protects the important coastal forest and wetland habitat. And it is 2,200 hectares or 5,500 acres. And it's the largest NCC nature reserve in Atlantic Canada. Our goal is to see the conserved land surrounding the Musquash Estuary double in size through combined efforts of NCC and our partners. And as I mentioned, because it's such a large area, there are multiple habitats that we've conserved that support breeding birds and migratory birds. So there's these rocky coastal shorelines, which are really important for sea ducks, such as the common eider. On the top right, you can see a bog, which hosts the palm warblers during the breeding season. At the bottom left are Acadian forests, dominated by red spruce trees, and they are home to species of grouse as well as thrushes like this hermit thrush. And then on the bottom right are this vast network of salt marshes, which are home to the Nelson sparrow as well as many groups of ducks. And people have been helping us collect data at the Musquash Estuary through different citizen science or community science efforts, such as through eBird and iNaturalist. And you can see at the eBird site in the Musquash Marsh, 136 species of birds have already been seen. And within our NCC boundaries, which are highlighted in yellow on the right, 329 species of plants, insects, and birds and others have been seen. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Vari.
Thanks, Allison, for sharing your experiences with shorebirds at Johnson Mills and the cool technology used for tracking migration, as well as the information on the diversity of species relying on the Musquash Estuary. I'll turn it quickly to Vari for some closing remarks before we open up the very active Q&A session.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you, Alison, for sharing with us your experience with conserving migratory birds and other wildlife in Atlantic Canada. By now, hopefully you'll have been inspired by how incredible birds are and how important they are to all of us every single day. I hope also you've been excited by some of the work that the Nature Conservancy of Canada is doing right across the country to help birds and other wildlife. I want to chat about some of the things you can do at home as well if you'd like to help our little feathered friends. It goes without saying, of course, that so much of our work would not be possible without generous support from people like you who donate money and volunteer their time to help us achieve great things for conservation, often in partnership with many, many other organisations. We're so very grateful for your support. Some other things you can try out at home include reducing the time your cat spends outside. Outdoor cats kill between 2 and 3 billion birds every single year in Canada alone. And the problem with this is that cats are not a natural part of our ecosystems, and so they can have a devastating impact on bird populations and populations of other animals. I had lots of fun making this catio for my 3 cats so they can still get some safe outdoor time while protecting wildlife. Another tragic thing that we can prevent at home fairly easily often is birds flying into windows. There's some fantastic resources online, and I recommend that you visit the Fatal Light Awareness website, or FLAP for short, for some simple tips and tricks. The little dots you can see on the outside of my window on the right up above the cat are barely noticeable from the inside, but are visible enough to stop birds flying into the glass. If you have a dog, please do keep it on leash when you're visiting natural spaces, or even consider leaving him at home in some cases. As we heard from Alison especially, every moment a bird spends reacting to even a friendly dog is precious time that they're not eating or feeding their young, which can be really quite devastating. If you like getting your hands dirty and have a garden or a balcony, then you can consider adding some native plants to your space. Native plants are beautiful, low maintenance, and do so much to support birds and other wildlife. That's because native plants support more insects than non-native and ornamental plants, and insects are an essential food to a surprising proportion of bird species. Even some of our birds of prey, like American kestrels, and little tiny birds like hummingbirds, although they drink nectar a lot of the time, they also depend on insects at various points in their lives. If you have a bit more space, you could also consider adding a nest box and see what kind of birds you can attract to your outdoor space. And finally, if you're inspired to learn more about birds and how you can help them, remember they are everywhere, like we said at the beginning. Despite everything we've said about these regular flyways and all of the amazing research that's going into understanding where birds fly, they do sometimes get off course, and especially during migration season, almost anything is possible. For example, some of you might have heard about the little Hume's warbler that was seen for just one day in Toronto this past weekend. This tiny warbler normally calls Central Asia home, so he was very lost. Get outside locally and see what birds you can find, and I hope you'll learn to love them as much as I do. And with that, back to Catherine.
Thanks so much, Vari. And thank you to all the speakers for giving us some ideas for how we can help the birds and support NCC in our critical mission. Now, we've had quite a few questions come in on the Q&A. I'm going to see if I can scroll up and get to the first one. So I'm going to direct this one to Vari. The question came in, I feed birds in the winter. Is it necessary to continue in the summer?
That's a great question, and it depends on so many factors, it's hard to give an answer. It depends a lot on where you live and what the habitat is for birds around where your feeders might be. I actually prefer planting native plants in my garden because I know that that's supporting exactly the right kind of food that the birds have evolved to eat. I do enjoy having feeders in my garden in the winter so I can see birds and help them out through some of those harsher times. But in the summer, I often take them down or don't refill them and let birds kind of learn to forage in the habitat that I've created back home. One exception to that is, and again, it's probably more for my own pleasure than necessarily to make much difference for the birds themselves, is I have hummingbird and oriole feeders because it's really cool to see birds like that up close. Whatever you do decide to do, then make sure you keep your feeders very, very clean because it's a very easy way for birds to pick up disease and transmit them between individuals, because many species that will come to feeders don't normally feed in kind of large groups. So having an artificial feeding station can be a real magnet for disease. So just make sure you take them down and keep them really clean every day if you can.
Okay, I'll move on to the second question here. This one got a lot of votes as well. I see robins at this time of year, but during the summer, they seem to disappear. Am I imagining this, or do they go elsewhere? I'm going to send this one back to Vari as well, because I feel like I do the same thing here in Ontario. I don't know if it's the case for Saskatchewan or Atlantic Canada, but certainly in Ontario, the robins are very, very busy right now. Where do they go?
Yeah, it's a great question, and people notice this a lot, that often at this time of year, or in this case, this year in Ontario, over the last few weeks, birds have been really busy, moving, coming back from migration. We've had a fairly early spring in some ways, and then people notice everything disappears, or it seems to disappear. And that's often because birds then spread out and set up territories, and they're quietly raising their young, trying to hide from us and predators. So this morning on my walk in London before work, I found 3 or 4 robin nests, and the robins were sitting completely silently on their nests, hoping that I wouldn't notice them as I walked past. So that's often why you suddenly feel like there's no birds, because they're all quietly hiding. They've dispersed off into the territories. Some individuals have continued their migration further north as well, so they've spread out across the country.
Cool, I learned something new too. Okay, so why do migrating birds actually come north to breed? Are they running out of resources in their southern winter homes? I'll direct this one to Allison.
Yes, that's a great question. I believe it's just sort of part of their evolution. I know the food sources in the north in the summer are very rich, like just so many flies and insects rising from the muskeg and things like that. So I think sandpipers, especially Arctic breeding ones, have just evolved to follow the food sources and time their migration accordingly to when the peak food is arriving and when they can best provide all that food to their young.
Thanks, Allison. The next question comes from Brian, and it's for Mike. Why are migration numbers lower in the fall than in the spring?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I covered it really briefly there, just kind of as making my way through the presentation, but couldn't really, in the interest of time, elaborate too extensively. So what they actually do is they arrive in kind of southern Saskatchewan in right around now up until about as late as early June. And that kind of corresponds with when a lot of the brine shrimp in the lake, in Chaplin Lake in particular, are really kind of at high numbers. And then that kind of tail dissipates after a little while, and then they kind of make their way up further north. And then if they were to come back in the fall the same way, there wouldn't really be the same level of food resources for that volume of birds in particular. So they do what's called an elliptical migration. So they'll come north through the center of the continent, through that mid-continental flyway. They'll reach the Arctic and kind of those islands up in the Arctic archipelago. And then on the way back down, instead of coming straight back south, they kind of do more of an eastern, southeast path that way and kind of hug some of those islands, James Bay, Hudson Bay, and kind of the Atlantic coast as well, and some of northern Quebec. And then a lot of them will follow the Atlantic coast of the US seaboard, kind of back to Florida, and then hop over to the Gulf of Mexico. And some of them either stay there or will continue migrating further south into South America from there.
Thanks so much, Mike. Our next question comes from Aaron, who asks, what can your average person do to help conserve and secure lands for migratory birds, particularly in southwestern Ontario? Aaron, I have the same question. I live in Guelph and I grew up in Windsor, and there's not a lot of natural habitat left in southwestern Ontario. I know Vari is our director of science here in Ontario. What's the plan?
Yeah, that's a great question with many answers. So right here in Ontario, the Nature Conservancy of Canada is acquiring land and restoring it. So we've restored over 1,000 hectares of former agricultural land that we purchased in southwestern Ontario alone. We're currently constructing a big wetland on a property that we own on Peely Island, and is already, I hear, filling up with migratory birds that are heading our way right now, and I can't wait to get out and see them. We're doing a lot of work like that and in Norfolk near Long Point as well, creating more habitat to try and replace some of what's been lost, and helping migratory and breeding birds. As an individual, you can certainly do the same thing depending on your situation. As I mentioned with native plant gardening, think about native plants. That's the fundamental thing that we can potentially all do, whether we're privileged to own a large amount of land, or we have a pot on a balcony. So thinking about restoration with native plants can really be at any scale and will contribute to supporting more wildlife. So there are a few other organizations you can likely reach out to, but reach out to us and we can connect you depending on your specific situation.
Thanks, Barry. Another question for Mike. This one comes from Chris. What would be the longest distance that a migratory bird might take, and how long in terms of time would it take them to fly that distance?
Yeah, so one of the species that I spoke about briefly was the red knot, which is a shorebird species that does nest in the Arctic, but they actually spend the winters. So I should back up a little bit. There's 3 different subspecies that all winter in kind of different areas. So some of them winter in the Gulf of Mexico, but certain ones actually winter all the way south in like Tierra del Fuego at the very, very southern tip of South America. And those birds travel all the way north to Alaska, like along the Arctic Ocean and Bering Strait. And that's where those guys will nest. Again, making only a handful of stops along the way, usually, 4 or 5 days to feed here. There are some up to, a week or more. But most of those long, multiple thousand distance flights are done within the span of a couple days nonstop. So the longest one that I've seen as far as numbers go is about 30,000 kilometers, give or take. And that would probably take about a month's time, maybe a bit more or less than that.
Wow, that's a long way to go for a very tiny bird. Okay, this question comes from Peggy. When do orioles typically arrive in the Niagara Peninsula? Another Ontario question, so I'll hand it to you, Vari.
Well, I've seen reports of them in London, Ontario, just this morning and yesterday. So if you are wondering about popping out an oriole feeder in your property, for example, now would be a great time to do that. Keep your eyes and ears open. They are here right now. I think everything is maybe 2 to 3 days earlier than kind of normal this year in Ontario. So normally it might be a little further into the first week of May, but right now there's already a few individuals back, and we'll start like the previous question about why do birds disappear soon. You'll find that there's orioles all over the place for a couple of weeks, and then it will all go quiet and they'll kind of disappear as they continue to migrate and settle down to breed. So eyes open. I haven't seen one yet, but I'm hoping to maybe tomorrow morning.
Yeah, I had a couple of Facebook friends that were posting oriole photos. They're in Norfolk County, so they've got to be getting pretty close to the Niagara Peninsula. Okay, the next question comes from Doris. I recently purchased 22 acres of former farmland near London, Ontario for the goal of naturalization, primarily for the birds. Would this be on a migration path, and could you recommend any groups I could contact to assist me in this project? Another Ontario question, I'll send it back to you, Vari.
Sure. Well, congratulations on your acquisition. I'm very jealous, and it's so cool that you're thinking about supporting birds on their migration. Absolutely, we're right in the thick of things with migratory birds here in southwestern Ontario. I'm right in the city of London, so just close to you. In terms of what you can do, there is another organization called Alternative Land Use Services, or ALICE, and they have a chapter in Middlesex County, I believe, and they provide advice and I think in some cases financial support for people in your situation who might want to do some restoration with wildlife in mind as part of an active farm. So that would be a great organization to look to. Feel free to reach out to us. We can do our best to connect you to some other resources that best fit your needs. But yeah, that's super exciting. There's a lot of migratory birds coming through right now. The warblers are coming back, as you heard a minute ago. The orioles are just about here, so you can certainly do a lot to help migratory birds in southern Ontario for sure.
Okay, the next question comes in from Debbie, and she asks, explore.org has cameras on the Mississippi Flyway. Would you consider a partnership for the Pacific, Central, or Atlantic flyways? I guess, Allison, you haven't answered one in a while. Have we got any cameras set up on the Atlantic Flyway?
Yeah, so this is the first time that I'm learning about explore.org, so I'll definitely have to check it out after this presentation. I guess we don't have any cameras set up that I know of. Something that is being looked at is like weather radar to look at vast movements of birds, because you can actually see it like on the screen. And there is another website called birdcast.com, I believe, and it's only in the US at the moment, but it actually shows, it has these forecasts of when pushes of migratory birds are coming through, and it is quite dependent on the weather as the birds wait for optimal weather to make their trip. So I guess that would be my answer there.
Thanks. Another one going to be coming back to you, Allison. So do the nano tags, or any tags for that matter, harm the birds in any ways?
Right, I thought we might receive a question like this. So the tags are very small, about the size of our thumbnails, and very light. And before any research program would go ahead to put them on birds, butterflies, or dragonflies, they have to go in front of an external panel of experts as part of an animal care process. And so only projects that are deemed safe for the animals are able to go ahead.
That's very reassuring to hear. Our next question comes from Xavier, who asks, how many migrations would the sandpipers do in their life cycle? Michael, perhaps you could tackle this one.
Sure. So there's a lot of different numbers that are kind of floating around, and there are so many different species of sandpipers, it's hard to give a real hard, solid answer here. But I have read that the kind of average lifespan can vary from kind of 10 to 15 years, depending on the species, with some recorded even upwards of 15 in like the 16-year-old range. It's also very hard because a lot of birds are tagged and they're already adults. So it's hard to track exact ages like that, but that 10 to 15 is kind of an average for most of those species. So they complete these migrations every year. So I mean, anywhere from 10 to 15 of those back and forth trips for sure.
Wow, it's a lot of travel, especially these days. Okay, next question. This one's anonymous. You've told us what we can do and what NCC is doing to help conserve birds across Canada. But what happens when the issue causing the migratory bird species loss isn't happening in Canada? I'll actually tackle this one myself. It's a great question, and I work as NCC's Director of North American Partnerships, because there are North American initiatives that are undertaken. It isn't simply work that's happening in Canada, but there are continental conservation plans in place. In some cases, what's driving the species loss isn't happening in Canada, as the birds may have had their wintering habitats be degraded in Central or South America, or even the southern United States, or it could be a timing mismatch as a result of climate change. Well, whereas one queue used to send the birds south and have the insects emerge at the right time, perhaps there's a mismatch in timing now where the temperature cues for some of the bugs aren't happening and the birds are flying to land there. So there are issues that go beyond what can be done in Canada. Fortunately, there are international teams that identify and tackle some of these issues all along the birds' flyways. Though not highlighted in this presentation, NCC does work on the Pacific Flyway, and there are two joint ventures on the BC side of things that NCC participates on. So joint ventures are a group that come together. They include NGOs, the provincial and federal government, as well as external partners. The Pacific Birds Habitat Joint Venture in particular is an international joint venture where experts come together to develop comprehensive conservation plans for these species. We know that there are challenges all along the migratory path. I guess we can be somewhat comforted in knowing that the birds coming back to Canada now have these nesting and breeding sites to provide the next generation before they undertake this perilous journey. And we've got one last question up, which is, how can someone get involved with your organization? I guess I'll turn this to Allison.
Okay. Yes, so on our website, there is a section called what you can do. And there's a chance I might need a bit of help from another, maybe Catherine, to fully get this question right, just because there are so many different ways to get involved. So yeah, I might need your help.
Well, there's definitely opportunities for individuals to get involved with Nature Conservancy of Canada. I would direct you to our website, www.natureconservancy.ca. On the individual regional websites that deal with activities happening in each province, they'll outline nature destinations, places where you can get out and experience nature firsthand when it's safe to do so. There are also volunteer opportunities that come up from time to time, and there's plenty of educational resources. You can also meet with NCC in person when it's safe to do so. We do encourage the public to contact us. We may be a bunch of introverted birders and botanists, but we do enjoy some time spent with like-minded individuals as well. So I guess for now, I believe that's all the time we have for questions today. So if we didn't get to your question, or have something else that you'd like to ask any of our panelists, or you have a topic request for a future webinar, please feel free to reach out to us at events@natureconservancy.ca, and we'll be sure to get back to you. Thank you again to everyone who joined us for today's webinar. Vari, Mike, and Allison, thank you so much for sharing your insights and expertise. For updates on future webinars and events in your area, check out our events page at www.natureconservancy.ca/events. So stay tuned for the link to today's webinar recording. You'll receive that in our follow-up email within the next 24 hours. On behalf of the Nature Conservancy of Canada, thank you again for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your day. We hope to see you next time.